Hi guys, welcome to the Alternative Podcast. This is episode 27. We've got a special guest on today, Gleb. He's originally from Russia, left Russia in 2016, lived in various other countries. He now currently resides in Georgia. So Gleb, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for inviting me, Cam and Aaron. I think it's a great opportunity for me to speak with someone outside of Georgia. And just thinking about our first meeting, I was reflecting on my own experience, and I was trying to count the countries I lived in. Not many, but it's interesting that my first, as you said, I was born in the USSR in Russia, the communist country, the socialist country, and then I went to study in the US in the 90s. So I left the USSR and I returned to Russia when it became an independent state. Then I lived in Russia, transitioning into democracy, and I observed the failure of democracy as well. So I lived in two Russias. And I left Russia in 2016 and lived in the UK, in Belfast. I was doing my work with one of the banks there. And then in 2018, end of 18, I moved into Georgia because I didn't want to return to Russia. I already thought that, I want to live somewhere else. I want to try new experiences, and also partly because I didn't want to return. I was feeling the changes that were happening in Russia, and I thought maybe, and I visited Georgia before. I think it's a lovely country, and I have friends here, and everything worked out that way. That 3 years, almost 4 years on, and I live in Georgia and Tbilisi. So I can talk about my experiences with in the countries and talk a little bit about each country, but also the transformation that I observed during my visits in and out of the free world and into the developing world and back. And
Well, Gleb, how old were you when you left Russia the first time?
so I was 19, I suppose. I think, if that's correct. Yes, 20 or 19. So I left as an exchange student. And that was the first program, one of the first programs of exchanging students in the USSR, between the US and the USSR, part of the, I think, presidential initiative, Gorbachev and Reagan. And then that was interesting because that obviously are the formative years, and leaving the one regime and going into a completely new regime was quite formative and fascinating for me. So I studied economics. I'm trained as an economist, and I do also HR work recently. So I've been doing HR for maybe 15 years or so. Human resources, mainly learning and development, but also something around employee engagement and coaching managers.
What was life like growing up in the USSR?
So where do I start? Spooky dentists or porky pig cars, clunky, and but it was it's a good question actually, because a lot of young people, people that I meet and who are surprised but what's going on and what's happening with the country recently, some of them speak highly of the USSR, or spoke highly, or have some sense of nostalgia. But I think it was, if I were to pick one word, I think it was quite dull or quite heavily regulated, bleak maybe, because not only because the deficit and difficulty to find normal regular products or clothing, right? Because people try to find things that were brought from the West, especially clothing, not much food, but clothing definitely. And you had to, like, the life was predictable. The life was, you could expect certain living standards, right? It was, everyone felt safe, but also a bit of miserable at the same time. If you were not well connected with the Communist Party, or if you were not in some shadow economy, I think for regular people, the future was guaranteed. Like, you get your education, which was quite, I think it was good. But then, like, every step of your life is almost predetermined, and you just follow the rules. You don't do anything that's forbidden, or you behave like the Communist Party wants you to behave, and basically you're set in life. Not something that people really, not all people really appreciated that. And also in the Communist Party itself, I think the reforms started because of, we had this gerontocracy, is that the word? The old people ruling, right? And they, the communist bosses kind of occupied the higher ranks, and it was difficult for young people to progress. And I think that's where reforms started. Aside from the, the economical parts of it, the oil prices that went down.
So, with you having obviously lived in the West as well, there's a lot of people at the moment in the West, especially in the US, who are hoping for socialism to come to the US. What's your opinion on socialism in the US? Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think it will work? Do you think, or have you got anything to tell or to advise on the people who are wishing it in the West?
Interesting, because actually I think I met more people sympathizing with socialism in the UK rather than in the US, but maybe it depends on each person's experience. That was surprising, definitely, because I felt people have no idea what they're dreaming about. And, we had discussions with my friends about that, and sometimes, and, with acquaintances too. And sometimes people think of it like they idealize it. And they think that there were made mistakes, and maybe, we will build the proper socialism. We will avoid the mistakes you've made. But if you look at the history of socialism, you wouldn't find too many successful socialist countries, or countries that accept communist ideology, except maybe for China. But it's interesting with China because they embraced capitalism at the same time with the Communist Party at the helm. They actually introduced capitalistic institutions. That's what helped the communists, raise the standard of living. And this is remarkable. But all other experiments, I'm not sure there are any successful implementations. And I think in these discussions, people more like, if you try to break down the topic, what is this socialism to you? And then when you talk about what they mean by building socialism. It's actually simple things like available healthcare, education, equal opportunities for people. And they're good things, right? And a lot of liberal democracies, which are capitalist countries, they're trying to build these things with different success, granted. But if you look at the Scandinavia, I think they pride themselves as an equitable society, and they have, I think, is it that they have the highest happiness index or whatever this metric is. But people are happy there, and have they have to work. It's impossible just to to just use the system to work the system, right? Well, possible maybe for some people, but the generally accepted attitude is that if you work hard, you can achieve a lot in the capitalist society and still have many perks of socialism available to you.
Where do you think these where countries have experimented with socialism in the past, where do you think it's gone wrong for them? Why do you think socialism has failed? Is it because the governments have had too much power? Corruption got sort of messed up the whole ideology that these people had. Where do you think it went wrong?
I think the main failure is trying to control everything. And when, like, I can speak maybe from the experience of me living in Russia, I think the failure was that the economic failure, I think, was the main thing. And I think it also, the underlying probably cause is lies in ideology, because the central planning system, when you try to tell each factory how much of what they need to produce, and then you tell other factories or retail chains what they need to buy at what price, this kind of regulation is excessive, and you can't be so prescriptive in the modern world. People will want variety. They want to get the Levi's and Coca-Cola, and they want to go to McDonald's. So I think the hearts were lost as well, because people lived okay, but they felt like something that the government is not honest, and the government is trying to hide something from them, and that's where the double speak came about, and the anecdotes. I think someone was saying that anecdotes ruined the USSR because people laughed at things, not very good things, but Russian people try to find bright and funny things in even the bleak environments, because that's how we survive. Mm-hmm.
Really got enjoy. So, what was your obviously going as an exchange student over to America? I don't know what your perception of America was when you was living in Russia compared to when you actually moved to US. What was it, a shock, or was you expecting what you went into?
I think it was more or less predictable in terms of I think the most striking element was the discovery that what respect means and personal distance. In the USSR, we didn't have that a lot, and people were told what to do and how they should behave, and even what they need to think, right? It's an coming from an authoritarian regime. You prepare for the freedom, but you really have to experience it from the experiential perspective, rather than read about it in some newspapers or in television. And that distance, I felt it's a good thing. Like, people respect you for who you are. They're really interested in your own opinion. Because sometimes, in our Eastern European culture, or if that's a right way to say, but in the people coming from the totalitarian regimes, it could be an interesting change that, people can speak freely, they can do what they want with their lives. They don't have to always look at some grown-ups or communist party or someone telling them what to do. So I think that was important. And personal distance as well, like, even in the physical contact, you are talking to an American, right? You keep some personal space. The distance, it's bigger than in most countries. That was, I think, something that struck me then.
And I suppose going back to what you were saying about China and the fact they've set up their Communist Party in a slightly different way, do you think that's going to make? Do you think that's making the reason why it's lasting much longer, and it looks like it's going to last? Well, you can't really see an end in sight in for China's regime, because it seems like it's set up quite solid. But looking back at the USSR, did that seem like it was set up at the time as solid as China is today?
Yeah. I think they were really smart at adapting, and they was it Deng Xiaoping who started the reforms, and the foundation is that they have power that has to be changed. So even in a communist regime, if you have this institution that your government or your party leader has to change, I think that's really important. So it's an institution that we lack, for example, in Russia, that there is no succession planning, or there is no succession. It's also personalized and dependent just on one person, which seemed to be very different from China until recently, that Xi adopted this, unlimited power. I think, was it last year or this year, they agreed that he can rule indefinitely. So that's a risk. Yeah, that's a risk to the system. If you don't have a mechanism that can change your rulers, then you don't have the feedback loop between the population and the government, and then something will eventually break.
Yeah.
So, Gleb, in regards to Russia, they are considered, well, as far as I know, they're considered a democracy. But Putin has been in power for how long now? And how does he manage to retain that status for such a long period of time?
Yeah, I don't know who considers Russia a democracy now, but formally, Russia has a constitution. Russia has freedoms spelled out in that constitution, and courts, different branches of power, but nothing of that really works. So actually, the USSR had a constitution too, and it was arguably, I think, one of the more advanced constitutions in the world. But it wasn't followed. Like, Stalin's constitution was just a mockery, because everything was different in real life. So how Putin has come to be, for I think 23 years in power right now. So it was gradually. It's a sad story about like the 90s and the reforms that were made. The economic reforms, I think, were most significant and remarkable, but they lacked political reforms, like to really to reflect on the Soviet past and to talk and uncover and condemn the dark sides of the history, I think, and the role of the KGB in that history. So there were some voices, but unfortunately they were not the majority of voices, who warned about the danger of leaving everything as it is and allowing KGB to get away with everything they did during the 70 years in power. And that was a huge mistake, obviously, as we found out now. So Putin is a student of KGB, but also the mob. Like he learned from the mob and from the KGB, and now he built something completely authoritarian. And people, and I agree with the assessment that it's a fascist regime right now. A lot of people were not taking lightly this definition because of the fact that Russia was very, you know, that the sacrifice during the Second World War was enormous. And people were, and still people are in denial that Russia is a fascist regime. But you can open the books and you can look at the different definitions, and you can, I think, Timothy Schneider, a historian and a writer, I think he breaks down it nicely. What are the traits and how they, unfortunately, are present in modern Russia. So we have elections, but there is no mechanism to change power. It's all personalized. It's all dependent on one strong man. And people are not really keen to change it. What's more worrisome, that by and large Putin is supported.
Why is that? Why has he got? Because if Putin was to lead another country, for example, well, England or US, he wouldn't be supported even close to the amount he supported for running Russia. What's the reason why? Is it because he's seen as better than what there has been previously, or is there another reason?
I think part of his popularity is the economic environment, the high commodity prices in the 2000s, and this, windfall of petrodollars. I think they definitely helped. And he built his like the economic growth that happened in the 2000s was, I think, all because of the reforms that were made in the 90s. Because he's basically piggybacking on the reforms and the trends that were founded. The foundation was laid in the 90s. So, and he's taking credit for that. And people think that it's all about Putin, that they started to, to buy new cars, to go abroad and spend a lot and do all the fancy stuff. So that's the economic side of it. But the political side of it is also interesting, because he is quite skillful at manipulating people and exploiting the popular ideas about the great Soviet past or the great Russian history. So he played that quite well, and that resonated with most people. So they were, even as the economic situation started to deteriorate in recent years, the problem with there is still quite large support for his foreign policy. Like, people approve his. Maybe they don't approve the war. We will talk about that later. But by and large, like the dream to remain a superpower, I think it's still there, and he got away with all the economic difficulties, and people are ready to go through hardships because they think that they can trade their personal well-being for the good of the country, and he's playing that. I think people will be realizing that that the link is broken, that it's not the right trade to make, and that they need to wake up, but the process is very slow.
So at the moment, we're seeing Putin and Xi Jinping seem to be quite close, and they seem to be building quite a strong relationship. How powerful and how strong is Russia at this moment in time with that relationship with China? So how strong is Russia as a country, knowing that they have China there who they can sort of look for support?
I think it's interesting, Aaron. I think the country is either strong or weak in itself, by itself, right? But as you say, it could be supported by a larger power, and it could feel that it is stronger with the friendship or alliance with that power. But that's just an impression, right? So the country is definitely weak because of the stagnation of, I was saying that this kind of the power that was the wealth that was accumulated during the good years, right? It's been wasted now at a tremendous speed. I think that we are past, maybe we are moving back into the 90s or the USSR years in terms of economic might. Political might, I think, again, they overestimate their influence, consistently overestimate. But I think the wake-up call was this arrest warrant last week, was it? So I think that was maybe one wake-up call, a huge one. But Xi Jinping's visit, everyone was like, the Kremlin propaganda tried to spin it as a huge success and everything, but we could feel it's actually not, because I think the visit was not as long as it was planned. It was shortened, and then after they talked and signed some agreements, and then Xi, I think he reinforced that Russia should be committed to non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and like he tried to influence that. And then after he left, Putin went to Lukashenko, the Belarusian authoritarian monster, another fascist, and he said that we will try to move some tactical nukes to Belarus. So I think that tells a lot about the dynamics between the two leaders and what type of support is there. And also, if you look at the nature of this relationship, Russia is reliant on China in terms of they need to sell the energy, right? And they need India or China, someone to buy it, and the prices are obviously not favorable for Russia, and Russia has been like helping China so much. I think even before the war, and that's like they bought so much natural gas for just ridiculous prices, and I don't think it's like an equal relationship at all. So it's being exploited. I think China knows the weaknesses, and they know that they can bargain, and I think have some. They're not talking about that publicly, but I know in some of the the maps they have in China, they show some current Russian territories of their own. So I think there is a territorial dispute as well between China and Russia, and I think that at some point it will come up. Not to mention the existing, like how much timber or how much forest they move from Siberia into Russia, and again, what type of economic relationship is that? That people are so dependent in the Far East on China going in and cutting the trees and sending it all to
Yeah.
China.
I've not heard about this. China are considering some of Russia's land to be of their territory.
Yeah, that's true.
That's that's a recipe for disaster, obviously. Sooner or later.
Yes. I think I don't think that like currently they haven't voiced anything in terms of their geographical expansion. Maybe apart from Taiwan, we haven't heard from them like they have ambitions for or claims for some territories. But that's potentially something that it's a time bomb, I think, and they have effectively they don't need a territorial expansion, to be honest, because of the type of contracts, favorable contracts they already sign, and they get all the resources, all they need without expanding. So
Yeah, I guess they'll operate in a similar way to how the US have operated over the past 100 years. They've not really taken actually own territory, but they do call the shots or used to call the shots when it comes to certain things like what happens in Saudi Arabia, how they sell their own oil. They sell that in a petrodollar or not. So I guess China will use a similar sort of strategy as how the US have been doing.
Yes, I think the soft power and economic power, I think it's a smarter strategy for countries to expand their influence in a non-violent way. And that's important. I think it's one of the advantages of the globalization is that as the world becomes smaller, people, are forced to cooperate, and they are incentivized to live in peace rather than come to these clashes and think that by territorial expansion they can get more power. It's the opposite of that. They just lose the reputation and everyone hates them after these annexations.
Yeah. And then the amount of resources they use in the actual process as well.
Exactly. So the damage is in the modern world is huge, but the people in the Kremlin, they still have this mindset of territorial thinking, or that the modern world is a zero-sum game. Like if they get something, someone has to lose. But actually, it's just such a stupid notion that to be powerful, to be respected, you have to use brutal force. It's just outdated and it's immoral, first of all, but also it's not smart.
Yeah, because obviously the internet plays a factor in today's day, and then globalization plays another factor. So, whereas in the past it would be quite uh, a simple chess move to take territory, whereas now you've got to think of a number of different external factors before you make a move. I guess with the China side, do you have an opinion on whether or not they're actually going to make a move on Taiwan?
Oh. Maybe I should have said a disclaimer even before we started that I'm no political expert. Unlike some of your guests before me, I am, as I said, someone who lived and traveled, but I don't have a crystal ball, of course. Nobody has it, actually. We can only speculate. We can only think. It just, it's interesting. It's fascinating in this situation, and building on the our topic about cooperation and expansion. I think I was expecting that Beijing would think about, again, building economic ties and kind of soft power around this situation. And it doesn't seem, even now, it doesn't seem, despite all the nuclear or military saber rattling, I think despite of all that, it just doesn't make sense to occupy a country in the 21st century. To me personally, I don't know what the benefit would be. Like, they have obviously remarkable semiconductor technology there, right? And but there are people working in these factories, and people are used to freedom, and they want to, like, they would want to maybe work in a country where they are respected, where they have, do whatever they want. They want to be, and everything is taken away from them, and they don't have freedoms after that. So I don't think that they will be as productive in those manufacturing facilities as people who are genuinely happy, and they come to work to create. And why would they, have another supervisor in telling them what to do? I just think it's not compatible with how the modern economy of the world works.
Yeah, I suppose that's where, rather than taking a country over, you could look at forming better partnerships with countries, similar to what the West do anyway. They have decent partnerships with decent countries, and it keeps a nice sort of balance. I guess in a sense as well, that's what China do, and that's what it looks like they've done with Russia, is tried just to keep a bit of a balanced partnership where it's not too heavy of a partnership, so it disrupts their other partnerships with other countries, because that will be basically the end. If it's a difficult game, I think, the geopolitics side, because there's a lot of big egos in terms of the countries all trying to ramp up at once. So keeping that balance of partnerships is difficult. But doesn't China also have good relations with Ukraine? Because they've got good relations with Ukraine and they've got good relations with Russia now. Is that right?
Yes. I think they try uh, to have good relations with everyone, with the U.S. And despite all the talk about the contradictions, and I think they're still the biggest economic partner, and they will have to lose more from the conflict than they would have to gain. And Ukraine is the largest European country. Obviously, they have lots of plans there, and I think they should be thinking about the reconstruction as well, rebuilding Ukraine after the war. And who better at building stuff than China? So I think they have that in mind. But they're in good relationship with, I think, I don't know a country that they're in conflict with, to be honest.
So, Gleb, just a question about the war in Ukraine. What is Putin's ambitions? Is he trying to sort of reignite that USSR spirit and go and take over countries and expand territory? Is that his main goal from starting this war in Ukraine?
It's difficult to say what exactly drives him, but it seems that he's delusional and he has some. I think someone saying that he has some spiritual influencers, like from conservative circles, from religious people who talk to him in terms of like the fate of Russia, and that I think there is some of that. The other is he's completely delusional about how the modern world works. We touched on some of that too, like maybe some anecdotal evidence. He doesn't read internet. He gets his assistants or whoever is in his admin. They print out internet and they bring it to him in a nice red folder. So, what kind of mindset is behind that thinking is you can imagine probably. So, a person who is uh, like the old school KGB, he was not even successful at KGB. Some people say, but like he got something that he could from it, but he was not a remarkable officer. But then complete mediocrity. But then I think he was good at manipulating people and building his team of loyal yes people. And then at some point, this bubble, these yes people, they surrounded him with some illusion of the picture, and he is detached with reality. I think Angela Merkel, who visited him in early, what was it? A few years ago, maybe not a few years, but when was it? That it's probably after the Crimea, after the annexation of Crimea. She said that he's just living in his own reality. He just hasn't a clue what's going on. So that's part of it. Another part of it, and also the pandemic. Some people say that because he is so paranoid about COVID, and he surrounded himself with these strict procedures, barriers, disinfection, all sorts of medical tests for his surroundings, for his close circle, and people were struggling to get an audience with. And you saw that table, that huge long table that he was sitting at, talking again with his defense minister, and like with his people who should be like, he should be having a close contact with them. But I think there is lack of trust, paranoia about this COVID. I think they have influenced his mental ability. So I don't think he's sane. I think that there is some personality. I'm not a specialist here, but I think there is definitely an impact on his personality after 23 years of unlimited power.
Mm. And he's led by fear, right? So he's always led people in even his close circle. If he works in this way where they've got to print off documents and show them him for his sort of way of learning, how biased is that information going to be? Because I wouldn't want to be the person handing him some bad news in an envelope. I would rather just give him good news in an envelope. So, like you said, he's going to be so delusional. He's going to see the world in a completely different way to how it's actually things are run and things are going. And that's why maybe he was so scared, of COVID. And doing this fear-based, with this amount of power and keeping everyone in check purely with fear. I mean, people who are working with him or for him have no, I can imagine, I don't know for sure, but I can imagine they've got no sort of passion working for him. They're just scared. And that's just going to create paranoia, because you're just going to always be worried. You can't trust the people around you because you know none of them are actually loyal in a passionate way. They're loyal out of fear of death to them or even to their family.
Yeah, you're right. I think the biggest manifestation of the fear in his circle was for me on that meeting with his Security Council. There is a recording of that where they, like, he talks and then he asks his associates to speak, the people who are in charge of national security, and you could see a person that was, I can't remember the last name, but one of the the highest officials in the security apparatus. He was standing there with his knees shaking in that meeting, and he couldn't say a word. I think they were definitely, and they are still scared of him.
Yeah, because he's also got that mob mentality, hasn't he? So he's come from the mob, the mafia, or the mob, or what you call it, and how he's running the country.
So, if Russia are successful with their plans in Ukraine, do you think? I'm just trying to understand what NATO's motivations are for preventing Ukraine, not for their own strategic sort of planning on their side of things. Do you think if Putin does conquer Ukraine, do you think he will then look at other European countries and think, I'll take this one as well? Or do you think it stops at Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that was a possibility before 2022. Like, that was probably his way of thinking, that he got away with occupying, like, first of all, Chechnya, right? One of the Russian regions famous for a brutal regime of their local, like, he crushed any independence movement that was there, and that was a brutal war, like, devastating for the people, and people don't talk about it, but it was like, if you look at the pictures of Grozny, the capital, and Aleppo, for example, you could see that it's the same pattern there, right? The same basically picture, that they just ruin civilian infrastructure, they ruin residential buildings. So they don't look at the cost, like human life is worthless. They would just try to, and he got away with that, right? So that was an internal conflict within Russia. But then there was this war on Georgia in 2008. So do you know that 20% of Georgia is occupied by Russia currently? So there was a war in the 90s. That's when Georgia lost Abkhazia, a region near the Black Sea. And then there was another war in 2008, just as during the Olympics, I think the Beijing Olympics, there was a very short period, like 8 days or something, and they chopped off another part of Georgia, and then they got away with that as well. And then there was the Crimea, and again, impunity, nothing. Like, people were concerned, there were sanctions, there was this and that. And it kind of reinforced his thinking that he can basically get away with anything. Like, he can do this and that, and the NATO and all other countries will just be okay with that. But actually, what happened last year, I think, is quite remarkable, due, first of all, to the courage and tremendous mobilization in Ukraine, that they have shown that they're ready to fight for their country, and they're not giving up any inch of their territory. I think that commitment to winning, I think that told me, I think that even before the war, I think that was a stupid thing to do, and that was already programmed for failure. And I was tweeting at that time that Russia will be in ruins, not Ukraine. So Russia had already lost the war when it started it. I had no doubt that, and they still have no doubt that Ukraine will win this war. So your question is, what would happen if, Russia is successful in that war? It just doesn't exist for me. I just can't imagine that. I think, and the commitment of the Western leaders, I think that was important too, because they realized that, this is where we need to stop, making concessions. This is where I think if we do that, if we allow, Putin to win in Ukraine, then indeed your question, Aaron, becomes very valid, right? Then we think about the Baltic states, Poland, Georgia, who knows what he has on his mind, right? So, but after last year, I think that was an important, again, the price was huge, and all this piecemeal support with the weapons, and how do we support Ukraine, but how do we not allow Putin to lose his face? How do we allow Russia to also not to lose while Ukraine wins? That was, and I think is to this day, some of the rhetoric that I'm hearing from the West. But I think the consensus is that, and it's absolutely the biggest victory, I think, of Ukraine and all the free people in the world, that there is commitment that Putin shall not win this war. I think that the next logical step would be, how do we commit people, the good people of the world, to help Ukraine win this war, and not be too hung up on Putin losing his face, because who cares? And he's already lost everything. So Russia already failed. It's just a matter of time that Ukraine gets back the territories. But Russia, it's just, Ukraine will rebuild. But Russia, I think it's just such a moral catastrophe, and I can't imagine how the country will, what's the future for Russia then with this whole situation.
So a lot of what goes around in the Western media, not in the Western media, but in independent media in the West even, is that Putin's only doing a retaliation because NATO's pushed up to the borders. How much of this is a retaliation, or is it more of an excuse for Putin to make a move?
Yeah, I know that opinion, unfortunately, it is still, it's maybe not prevailing, but there is still this sentiment that, there is some truth to this war, because NATO was aggressive and expanding, and, we need to think about that. I think the reality is, though, that this narrative ignores the, what's the word for it, the agency of the independent nations. Like, they have, and they should have, control over their alliances, and who they want to align with, right? And Putin, I think it's probably part of his sincere belief that he doesn't think that Ukraine or the Baltic states or even, European states have authority, but that the real adversary is the US, and the US manipulates the EU, and they tell them what to do, and so on. And this expansion is perceived as indeed not the choice of the nations, but something that US is pushing and manipulating the countries to accept, which is nonsense, obviously. right? Because you can easily like you can look at, and we have a lot of examples of soft power, right? Even Turkey and in Turkey's influence in Central Asian countries. They would build universities there. They would invest. They would commit, and they kind of try to show their like benevolence, and they don't just want to come and appoint some puppet government in some country because they know that's impossible. People will discover that, people will be not happy, and that will be. But still, I think Russia and the politicians have chosen this way of thinking that there is no like these are not independent actors. Ukraine is a fake state. They were like one of his speeches was claiming that Ukraine was invented by Lenin. So again, I don't know who gives them this information because obviously Ukraine was where Russia originated from. Kiev Rus was the capital, the regional state, and then this idea that they're not normal, that they are puppet regimes. So it's ridiculous. I think it could make sense even maybe for some time, but obviously Ukraine had already changed their first president after the Crimea, so they have rotation of power, they have change of power, and then the big surprise, and I think one of the biggest failures again, this delusion, this misinformation, I think was the idea that Ukrainians will be meeting Russian soldiers as liberators. I don't know if they really believed in that. I tend to think that they honestly believed in that. But that's again ridiculous. Like they don't want to be, they never wanted to be associated. Although they work sometimes, we have big economic ties. We had the economic ties, and a lot of people from Ukraine worked in Russia and still work in Russia. But this idea that they are not independent, as they are ultimately, it's very sad, that this notion is reiterated in the liberal press. So if that's true, Cam, it doesn't make me happy. I think that's a big problem we need to deal with. We need to think how to like. It's a shameful narrative, actually.
Yeah. With anything, you're always going to get people who have a theory, right, on anything, and on definitely with wars as well.
So you mentioned that the narrative that we're hearing it's not through mainstream media we're hearing this narrative. It's mainly through independent sources, like through YouTube. So, like, my concern is in the West, there's a lot of mistrust with mainstream media. So, anything that's all over the mainstream media, automatically independent journalists or independent news broadcasters on YouTube or Rumble or whatever website you want to go to, they always have a counter narrative towards the mainstream media. And I think me and Cameron have spoke about it in the past. I think independent journalism is great and it's good because it puts out another voice that other people can listen to. But also at the same time, I think it can be very dangerous because when people have so much distrust for the mainstream media, they will look at independent journalists and listen to everything that they say. Whereas sometimes what they say isn't the correct narrative and what should be believed and could be misinformation. So it is a concern because I feel like these days there's so much misinformation around, you don't know where to go to and what to trust. Whereas I like to listen to all sorts of information. I'll probably never figure out what the actual truth is. But I believe talking to people like you, like real people who are there or closer to what's going on than we are, we get a closer insight to what the truth actually is.
Yeah, you're so right, Aaron. I think um, this trend that you mentioned, I think it accelerated also during the pandemic. Like people were genuinely skeptical about the vaccines and the right treatment or the restrictions. They didn't make sense to people, and they went out to seek out uh, unofficial or different sorts of sources, and that could be really dangerous. I think you guys have found, I think it's the best format for independent source to have real people in your studio, because you know the viewers can assess, you know, who is there and what they're talking, and that doesn't come across as some manipulated sensationalist, you know, type of source. And it's difficult, especially this year, after maybe a few weeks back after this ChatGPT was introduced, because now if you don't see the face, like they could obviously fake faces now and videos and audio and everything, but I'm now very skeptical with what I read on the internet, because I know that the genie is out there and you never know who has created a story, and they can even, you know, include all the sources into the story in the footnotes, and they could appear quite credible for you if you're looking for independent sources, but they will be bullshit, right? So I think the main skill now for people, and maybe few people realize that we are living in a very different world this year after this ChatGPT, and we've always needed to be vigilant, but we need now to be extra vigilant about what we read and who we trust, and is there a real person behind the story, or is there a fake algorithm that has learned to deceive us?
Yeah, that's where that element of trust has gone sort of out the window, where there's always, I guess it comes from the way the government's run as well as in the West, is there's always another reason why something's happening. So when the government says this is happening, a lot of people rush to be like, yeah, but why? And start looking into the background of, well, why is that happening? And I don't know, a lot with Biden, there's a lot of it's a lot to do with money, right? Backdoor deals, shady deals where money's getting made on the back of a story that they're putting out in the mainstream media. Um, so yeah, I 100% agree. It's you've got to do. You can't just take things at face value. You need to do a bit of external research. You're going to hear you can go on YouTube and hear a million different opinions on one subject, and none of them can even. Well, it's like with anything anyway. You've always got three sides to a story. If there's one side, the other side, and then there's the truth. But you're not going to actually experience the truth through any conversation unless you were there. That's the only way you can actually experience 100% authentic truth. But by getting all of the opinions that we possibly can and looking at it from a holistic view, we're not just forced down a single narrative where we're just forced to think, well, like you said, in the USSR, you were sort of forced to think a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something, well, obviously we need to avoid.
Yeah, but I'm glad that this is not a prevailing narrative, Aaron, that this is alternative sources. But this is the problem with them, with alternative sources, because the Kremlin and they invest a lot into these influencers, bloggers, fake accounts, and they have like big budget for that, and they can spin these narratives very easily. I think it's important that we don't amplify them, and we again learn how to differentiate who is who.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so and bit of a side question, but how was your time in Belfast, and how long
Mm.
were you in Belfast for?
So it was 3 years, and I was relocated by a company, and I worked as a learning advisor. So I helped managers to, to help their teams learn and to find learning resources and so on, to build good habits for learning as well. So the city is beautiful. I loved it there, and the climate, the people, the city. Um, I've not been a lot in many cities in the UK. Just obviously London, but Edinburgh, but haven't been to Manchester and such. But I liked it. The climate that the locals were complaining about. It was just perfect for me, and we like the walks, everything is after Moscow. So I lived in Moscow um, for again 15 or 13 years, and that's just a crazy city, like not suitable for quality life. Like you spend an hour in the subway on the way on commute, and then you go back, and then again 1 hour, and then you work long hours, and it was not healthy, right? And in Belfast, it was like you could be more productive because of the proximity of everything. Very compact, 15 minutes to the airport. Uh, the history as well is fascinating, and the conflict, is there is so much to learn from it, and I've learned about the history of Belfast and how it came to the peace agreement, Good Friday agreement, and how amazing transformation that happened after it. And it's up and coming too. Like because of the cost of living is not as high as in England, for example. I think that a lot of uh, employers are coming to Ireland, to the Republic, and to Northern Ireland as well. So it's up and coming in that regard. So obviously Guinness and uh, the pub culture, I really like that. My first gay pride. So we didn't have much of that in Russia. So that was again a very cool experience for me, and I've made a lot of friends because of English. I think it's been much more easy for me to build contact with people, of course, not just co-workers, but to meet people in different circles. For example, I was part of the Humanists UK gathering, and actually the member of UK Humanists for the time I was in there. Unlike Georgia, where most people would probably speak Russian here, but you don't want to impose Russian on them because some of them are not fluent and they don't have to speak Russian with you. And the younger people speak English here, but it's difficult generally to grow your network in a country like Georgia than in an English-speaking country.
Mm. Why did you move to Georgia?
Different considerations. I think the main motivation was not to go back to Russia because I kind of felt that the country has gone the wrong way, and I haven't had a good feeling about like all the crazy laws and repressions, and so and I was looking like what could be the possible countries not far from, like, I had a plan with my partner to actually establish a startup in Estonia. So, but Estonia is part of the EU and you need to have a visa. And before the visa, you need to come up with a minimum viable product, an MVP, and you have to work on the concept. So we thought that Georgia would be a temporary country for us to actually to build something and then to apply for the startup program and move. So we lived for 3-something years here, and then we moved to Russia because of the health issues and the family issues, and we had to be with our families for some time in Russia. So we stayed half a year in 2021, and then we returned back to Russia in January, and then we were again getting ready for the move to Estonia. But then in February, the war started, and we didn't have the visa and we didn't have anything, so we had to return back to Georgia. So basically, the story of ruined plans, personal plans as well. But I'm not complaining. I think that, you know, compared to what stuff is happening in Ukraine, and it's nothing. So we'll deal with that.
Do you still have a lot of family that live in Russia? And are they considering moving out of Russia or?
Yeah, the family, but my parents are quite elderly and they wouldn't want to move, and they enjoy their dacha, the garden. So it will be difficult to move them, and they don't want. My brother and his family, they've never considered leaving the country, and they are, you know, they think that that's where. Although I'm not sure about my nieces, the nieces might be thinking, at least maybe one niece could be thinking something, but I'm not sure. I don't know. I think they don't feel like there is a need for them to leave. It's not that they're happy with what's going on, of course, but I'm kind of person, once I lived in the free society, once you studied in the US, you lived in the UK, and you can compare things. You don't want to go back to the USSR or North Korea, whatever they're building there. So I had my mental goodbye to Russia in 2016, although it's frankly honest to detach yourself from what's going on. And when this war started, I was feeling, as I think most good people were feeling, responsible for it, right? Because although you didn't live there on a permanent basis, but it's still like, I feel that I somehow allowed it to happen. Maybe I was not resisting enough or raising awareness about this situation, but it's the sense of shame or responsibility. It's daunting. Again, not for everyone, but just for me personally.
Yeah, that's having an attachment with the country, so it's quite a natural feeling for a lot of people. As you say, it won't be everyone, but there'll be more than just you who will share that same feeling.
Yeah. So I'm learning like to discover my new identity now. Like, am I Russian? Or like it's quite interesting, even from the self identification. Like, how do you, like, to what extent do you need to be responsible for what's happening there? Like, you left the country in 2016, but then when this war started, I went out into the streets. I started to distribute leaflets against the war. I started to bring flowers to, there are some monuments after the Second World War for different cities that were heroic during the war, and I found the monument to Ukrainian cities. I left flowers there, and I was trying to speak with people also. But I felt that it was just all happening so quickly. We just have to pack our bags and to move quickly.
So, just going back to the war, how, I know it's a difficult question to answer, what I'm going to ask. I know world leaders can't even think of a real proposal for this, but what is your ideal view on how the war ends? How do you think we can get the war to end?
How, in terms of like the ideal way, I think the ideal way would be for Ukraine, obviously, to get their territories back and to be victorious, and then also to really bring the war criminals to justice. That needs to happen, and then the whole Russia again. You see, because I compared Russia to, like I said, it's a fascist regime. So there are some elements of Nazism because they think that Russia is a major nation or whatever. It's a superior nation and it has to rule over this huge territory. And also they have claims for the neighboring territories because they don't feel safe for some reason. And they don't think that people are independent. So there is an element of like this colonial nature in this war. And I think that needs to be addressed. Like when Germany lost, was defeated in the Second World War, there was a process of denazification, right? So a lot of Germans were not aware of the terrible atrocities that were happening. And some of them supported, and I think most of them supported. So they worked as a nation, they worked through that experience. And I think part of the victory should be Russia going through some kind of transformation and internalizing, reflecting on what happened, like seeing the criminals punished. I think that's important, and also like a program to make the country peaceful, to bring it to peace, and to let go of these world domination or Eurasia domination ideas. That's, I think, but I'm sure, about like the first part is probably it's difficult, right? But you kind of can imagine how that happens, like more weapons to Ukraine and helping them advance their forces and to regain the territories. But it's completely unfathomable to me, an idea like how do you change the mindset of millions of Russians, like so that they don't do that again, and they have realized the crime and the aggression for what it is, and they learn from it. So, and fascinating also that I spent 13 years or 15 years in learning and development and helping people learn and grow, right? And then I'm observing people degradation, like people unlearning how to think for themselves, being uncritical, being, closing in their bubbles, and that's I think is also an interesting topic in itself. How did that happen? How has it come to a place where, like in the Soviet Union, people didn't trust the state, and they learned to read newspapers. Like they didn't have alternative sources or internet. then, but they've learned to read the newspapers between the lines, you know. And when the party said that this is a big victory, this is this and that, people were skeptical. They were genuinely thinking that actually the message is not at all. So that was the prevailing attitude, not to trust the newspapers or official sources, not to take them with a grain of salt at least. But now people have access to information, unlimited access. And they can do their research and they can find sources. But when they hear this propaganda from state television, they're not critical. Like, I'm not saying they all, but a lot of people, most people probably, they tend to trust propaganda. And it's just so fascinating to me that this chance is just wasted. Like, you could have, even when I was staying with my parents, I subscribed them to an independent newspaper, which was later banned in Russia, but it was circulating up until 2022. Novaya Gazeta, you probably heard. And they have an English-speaking edition as well. And now they work from abroad. They publish from abroad. And I know that they don't like internet. They wouldn't read it on the internet. So that was a hard copy. The newspaper was coming to them and they could have read the stories about what's actually happening, but they chose not to. So it's quite painful in terms of observing people being uncritical and even turning a blind eye on things and to try to ignore things that are happening. And, you know, they should have known about them, but they chose not to. I think a lot of realization has come to them now, like I'm speaking about my relatives, but a lot of people after, I think, last year, I think they realized that there is, like, the propaganda is not to be trusted. And you can see by the opinion polls that fewer Russians are now watching the official news. So at some point, I think the level of absurdity in the state media and trying to show like some sort of victories and that everything is going according to plan, people have, you know, called out the bullshit and they don't want to take it anymore. But it took the war and how many lives lost before they realized that.
What sort of worries me about the war is the escalation of the war. I did read, I think it was last week, that the UK are sending uranium depleted missiles to destroy. So they used to destroy tanks because they hit into it. It's a lot more powerful than a normal missile. Obviously, it's uranium depleted, which means it's radioactive. And Putin has responded to that and said it's basically bordering on the line of nuclear warfare. And I think those were his reasons for putting. He put some nuclear missiles in Belarus, right? I think you mentioned before. I think that was what his reason was for doing so. But putting the war to sort of like Russia win or Ukraine win to one side, like, I think the escalation of the war is a big concern where it could affect the whole planet if it does go to if nuclear weapons are used.
Yeah, that's a big, indeed, concern. I think it's like we've never before, like maybe since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we've never experienced anything like that. I think we should take it seriously, but at the same time, I think it's important to be realistic about, you know, and knowing the capability and the mindset, I think is important. Like, he's been blackmailing for so long already, and I think that at some point, uh, politicians, or at least the Western, the NATO politicians, have made it clear that they don't accept it anymore. Like, you can't do that. And I think the Chinese leader is on this side as well, and he made it very clear that it's not acceptable. I think the Indian Prime Minister too. Like, the world leaders have, I think, told Putin on different channels that this is not acceptable, and don't even mention that, because there will be no victory. It's impossible. Like, you can only destroy the world, everyone. And I think that he's not the one. Like, if we talk about Putin, I think to me it's obvious he's not the one who would do that, who press the button, because, like, we talked about COVID and his paranoia and how he's shaking for his life. I think it's not the type of, like, a person who would do that. And obviously, if you look at the mechanism of how this works, you have to have a full chain of command on board with that, and he doesn't have that. So there is, I think, the army, although they haven't talked about that officially, but through different sources, we know that even last year they were very skeptical of the success of this war, and they just couldn't have the guts to stop it then, and they went along with it. But after what happened this year, they have realized that the capability is not there. Like from the technical standpoint, it wouldn't work probably, because they have been relying on their best whatever military technology in the conventional war, and it hasn't proved to be effective. And then I think people are skeptical that the old nuclear arsenal is in the good shape for any, like, not the right adjective, good shape, but in the working state to be used. So I think the chain of command will never allow that. So there will be always someone, I think, who will think for themselves, and they wouldn't just push the button or pass on the order. I think it's not doable now. I think Putin is in isolation. He knows that he has zero support apart from, I think, Venezuela and North Korea. So the world leaders have indicated the consequences of whatever he's planning to do, and I think he has abandoned eventually this idea of responding to any threat with it. Although you can hear that on this propaganda, on the state propaganda, they would talk crazy shit. Actually, sorry, my apologies for my language, but there is a brilliant blogger on Twitter who dissects the propaganda and this nuclear talk, crazy talk that's happening on Russian television about, like, we will destroy the UK, we will destroy the US, we will do this and that, and these are angry, delusional clowns, I think, but they're dangerous. It's not to dismiss that, like, there is zero chance that this will work, like this chain of command and everything, but I'm really skeptical that it would. But it's crazy that it has come to that. So I hope the minds better than mine, better than ours, would have calculated the risks and have told the consequences of what awaits any crazy person with the nuclear arsenal.
Without any escalation of the war, where do you see it leading to next? Or do you see it escalating further, but not to the point of nuclear warfare? Do you see NATO troops coming in?
I personally don't see, like, I was afraid, as everyone was when it all began, and I was afraid that the Western leaders would blink and that they would buy this, blackmail, and they would like, okay, we're not ready to fight, over Ukraine, and we can, make concessions, whatever, talk Ukraine into peace. That's also a ridiculous narrative that someone can decide on what terms this war needs to be ended, other than Ukrainians. Like, they are paying the ultimate price for their victory, and it's only up to them to decide. So I don't see escalation to the big nuclear thing. I think that these, the depleted uranium, again, this is Kremlin's propaganda pushing it, that this is escalation, but actually it is not. Like, there is a UN document saying that this type of material is not considered to be nuclear weapon. So, and it's just something that they try to, like, they always create an excuse to be offended by, or to be like feeling that they are, it's desperation. I think it's difficult to deal with that, but we shouldn't take seriously like all these exaggerations, their manipulation about like this is escalation. I mean, define escalation? At what point this war is not escalation? Like, they have destroyed already so many buildings, the cities, just wiped out cities. So to me, and Ukrainians, I think they done a poll among Ukrainians, and they said that like 80% or so they're ready to fight in spite of the nuclear threat. So even if they use something, they're ready to defend everything, and they wouldn't give up. So I think that the escalation has been beyond already possible to me. I think that the military activity, I think it's important maybe to use the right language for that. So when they liberate, they're going to liberate their territories. And I think calling that escalation is not correct. I think, and they will try to spin that as escalation. Like they would say, no way Ukrainian flag will be in Sebastopol in the Crimea. And they will say this is escalation, but you've already done all the escalation. And you've been warned what to expect from this. And the government, Zelensky, and the chief of the military, I think they've been very clear that their goal is to liberate their country. So I don't think that it's right to fall for this narrative that this would be escalation, like them liberating their country. So as, for example, issuing a warrant on Putin is not escalation. It's just the way that things should work. It's also a big mental game, I think, that we need to be conscious of. Like, they think that, and Garry Kasparov, actually, the chess champion, he's been very vocal about like the strategy of this game, this mental game with them. So he's been calculating the risks. Like, every time you say you don't want escalation, actually you are giving advantage to Putin to actually up their stake or to up their game. And he takes that as a weakness. And this is part of the mob mentality as well. Like, you don't show that you are weak. You don't have the right to blink. You need to be very firm with them, and you need to show the consequences. And that's, I think, the only way that we could win this war, if we are also mentally prepared.
Yeah, that's very true. That it's majority of it is a mind game. So, when you were talking earlier about how Germany had the Nazis, did the USSR take Nazis from Nazi Germany to work in there?
Yes, I think there were prisoners of war, and they were actually working to rebuild some of the cities. In my home city, Volgograd, which is more known as Stalingrad, there were a lot of buildings, rebuilt or built, new buildings built with these.
All right. Well, shall we wrap things up?
Yeah, cheers, Gleb. That was really good.
It's been really insightful, today.
Thanks for inviting me, guys. That was my pleasure. It's always good to bounce some of my thoughts as well with someone. So it's good to be connected.
Oh, great. Thank you for coming on. See you later, everyone.
Yeah. Cheers, Gleb. See you later, everyone.
All the best. Bye-bye.